Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I'd like to make a clarificational point, and this is sort of a follow-up to my video on Jordan Peterson. And the point I'd like to clarify is what philosophical pragmatism is, because it's different than what's ordinarily called pragmatism. Philosophical pragmatism is a radically different way of considering the question of what is true than we ordinarily have in the West. Because in the West, what we have is the question of, does this directly, unambiguously, almost literally, in a sense, correspond to what happened, what actually happened, in like a very descriptive sense, as in, could you, put this in extremely plain descriptive language and have that be literally true as a description of the world? So for example, when Christians say in the Nicene Creed that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, they literally mean that there was a woman with flesh who did not have sex with a man, who, by the power of the Holy Spirit, gave birth to Jesus. And then later, when he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, we mean very literally that that same man was nailed to a cross, where he then later died, by suffocation on that cross. So that's one way of looking at things. That's an extremely common way of looking at things, especially here in the West, especially as like the sole way of looking at things. Now, philosophical pragmatism asks the question of what is true in a very different way, because it sort of presupposes, as a practical matter, that you don't have a very complete literal description of the world. And that really the thing is, but even more to the point, rather, you don't have a big picture description of the world that is accurate. And so what you really need is, more than anything, a big picture description of the world that is accurate. And if the literal details do not actually correspond to the real world, getting the big picture right is vastly more important than getting the, some of the little details right, but utterly missing the big picture. And where this really comes up is in the question of, you can call it happiness. I'm going to quote Chesterton in a moment, where he calls this sanity. Jordan Peterson has also called it sanity in at least one video that I saw. I think he also sometimes calls it health. So various things like that all stand in for a human being actually living well. And that's, no, of course you'll find certain people saying, oh, I'm doing just fine. But anytime you actually look at it, they aren't. Anyway, so Jordan Peterson's language, and anyone who watches him, who is in a cultural sense really from that traditional Western perspective of the exacting sort of description, wherein you get both the big and the little picture right simultaneously, as in the Nicene Creed, or you get, the big picture wrong and the little picture right, as in, like, for example, most likely right, in, say, the way that Richard Dawkins looks at evolution, that, there's certain details about, the time period at which different animals existed and the likelihood of the descendant of them that he gets right, but he gets pretty much the entire universe wrong, the point of it, and there's all sorts of things you can see about life and so on that he's just catastrophically wrong about. Now, philosophical pragmatism is saying that between these, if you have to make an error where you get the big picture right but the little details wrong, or you get the little details right but the big picture wrong, the truer description of the world, because neither of these is completely true would be getting both the big and the little picture correct, the big picture and the details correct. If you can do that, great, no issue. But what philosophical pragmatism really consists of is that if you have to get something wrong, get the details wrong, not the big picture, because the big picture relates to human happiness, and the little details don't really matter very much at all. So, I talked in my video about Jordan Peterson, about Jordan Peterson's approach to this, but I want to share Chesterton's approach, in which he does something very similar, although he doesn't sound like Jordan Peterson at all. And I think seeing the same basic thing said in a very different way may be helpful. So this is from Chesterton's masterpiece, Orthodoxy, which hopefully everyone will have read several times already by now, but if not, I'm going to read just two small sections. This is from the very beginning, in which he's introducing his method. So just to give you a tiny bit of background, he was arguing with an editor about a bus that had the word Hanwell written on it, and Hanwell was the name of a famous insane asylum in England. Chesterton lived in the and was writing especially in the early 1900s in England. But I think this book may well start where our argument started, in the neighborhood of the madhouse. Modern masters of science are much impressed with the need of beginning all inquiry with a fact. The ancient masters of religion were quite equally impressed with that necessity. They began with the fact of sin, a fact as practical as potatoes. Whether or no man could be washed in miraculous waters, there was no doubt, at any rate, that he wanted washing. But certain religious leaders in London, not merely materialists, have begun in our day not to deny the highly disputable water, but to deny the indisputable dirt. Certain new theologians dispute original sin, which is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved. Some followers of the Reverend R.J. Campbell, in their almost too fastidious spirituality, admit divine sinlessness, which they cannot see even in their dreams. But they essentially deny human sin, which they can see in the street. The strongest saints and the strongest skeptics alike took positive evil as the starting point of their argument. If it be true, as it certainly is, that a man can feel exquisite happiness in skinning a cat, then the religious philosopher can only draw one of two deductions. He must either deny the existence of God, as all atheists do, or he must deny the present union between God and man, as all Christians do. The new theologians seem to think it a highly rationalistic solution to deny the cat. In this remarkable situation, it is plainly not now possible, with any hope of universal appeal, to start, as our fathers did, with the fact of sin. This very fact, which was to them, and is to me, as plain as a pikestaff, is the very fact that has been specially diluted or denied. But though moderns deny the existence of sin, I do not think that they have yet denied the existence of a lunatic asylum. We all agree that there is a collapse of the intellect as unmistakable as a falling house. Men deny hell, but not, as yet, Hanwell. For the purpose of our primary argument, the one may very well stand where the other stood. I mean that as all thoughts and theories were once judged by whether they tended to make a man lose his soul, so for our present purpose all modern thoughts and theories may be judged by whether they tend to make a man lose his wits. So you can see here where he's essentially proposing a beginning in philosophical pragmatism, not because philosophical pragmatism is the proper resting place of man, but rather because mankind is presently in a very dire situation and needs somehow to get out of it. And so he's proposing a dire expedient that may help to get us out of it. And then skipping ahead, he then says, a few pages later, "It must be understood that I am not now discussing the relation of these creeds to truth, but, for the present, solely their relation to health. Later in the argument I hope to attack the question of objective verity. Here I speak only of a phenomenon of psychology. I do not for the present attempt to prove to Haeckel that materialism is untrue, any more than I attempted to prove to the man who thought he was Christ that he was laboring under an error. I merely remark here on the fact that both cases have the same kind of completeness and the same kind of incompleteness. You can explain a man's detention at Hanwell by an indifferent public saying that it is the crucifixion of a God of whom the world is not worthy. The explanation does explain. Similarly, you may explain the order in the universe by saying that all things, even the souls of men, are leaves inevitably unfolding on an utterly unconscious tree, the blind destiny of matter. The explanation does explain, though not, of course, so completely as the madman's. But the point here is that the normal human mind not only objects to both, but feels the same objection. Its approximate statement is that if the man in Hanwell is the real God, he is not much of a God. And similarly, if the cosmos of the materialist is the real cosmos, it is not much of a cosmos. The thing is shrunk, The deity is less divine than many men, and according to Haeckel, the whole of life is something much more gray, narrow, and trivial than many separate aspects of it. The parts seem greater than the whole. So, you can see Chesterton here starting off, and that starting part is very significant, in much the same way that Jordan Peterson talks. I mean, in much the same way that Jordan Peterson does approach things. He is not talking using the same sort of language that Jordan Peterson is. He doesn't say the same sort of thing, he doesn't use the same diction, he doesn't use the same distinctly materialist sort of, speech patterns, diction, and so on. And yet, he's saying the same thing. Now, anyone who's especially familiar with Chesterton, read, say 5 or 10 of Chesterton's books, will know that Chesterton very much believed in the literal truth of the Nicene Creed. There's absolutely nothing about Chesterton's relation to Christianity that was in any way metaphorical. However, you can see he uses that same starting point precisely as throwing a drowning man a rope. And so that's presented as another take on philosophical pragmatism. So you can sort of see, in two different approaches to the same sort of thing, that they both have, and especially Chesterton is very explicit about having, and Jordan Peterson mostly, in many cases, is explicit about having, that approach that starts off with, you're asking the wrong questions. It's not that there aren't answers to the questions that you're asking, but you're asking the wrong questions. You're starting from entirely the wrong end. And, it's a little bit like if you were teaching somebody to do diving. You would teach them first how to climb the ladder and how to jump off the diving board. You wouldn't teach them how to enter the water first, because you don't enter the water on the ground. You need to, be able to get up. It's not a great analogy. If you were to take something, more complex, drawing from my own experience in Lindy Hop, you don't start off by teaching people how to dip at the end of a dance. Not very useful. And, eventually you might, learn how to do that, but there's that whole, process of partner dancing that you need to do, and be able to do for several minutes with another person on a dance floor where you're not crashing into anybody, before you get to the part where you're actually worrying about how to dip anyone. And what the modern West, in its post-Christian sense, is kind of doing is like that. They're like people who don't know how to dance, but only know how to dip. And so they're sort of trying to treat all of life as just, they're doing nothing but dipping their partner, and it's not much of a dance. And, it's not the best metaphor, but it basically illustrates the point that you've got people who are going about things all wrong, where they're getting one small and not very important thing right, and they're getting most everything else wrong. And what's worse, they're fixating on the small thing they are getting right to a degree that they can't get anything else right. Because, taking the hypothetical people who only know how to dip, if you tried to then show them partner dancing, they said, well, that's not dipping. My partner would be standing straight up. That's a terrible dip. And you try to say, like, well, you're not dipping your partner at all here. You are, dancing with them. Like, that's not a dip. No, it's not a dip. That argument goes precisely nowhere. What you have to do at some point is take them and shake them vigorously, give them a good airplane-style slap and say, try something other than dipping. Stop dipping for now. Do something else, like dancing. And so that's the key to viewing philosophical pragmatism. If you thought of philosophical pragmatism as a resting place, as a finishing point, that you adopt philosophical pragmatism and stay there, that would be terrible. That would be awful, because that is a complete disregard of the truth at that point. But only as an ending point. As a starting point, it makes a lot of sense for somebody who is in the position of our hypothetical, Dawkins dancer, who can only do, one small thing and won't do anything else. That what they need to do is stop unlearn the mistakes they have learned, stop doing even the thing they can do right for the moment, and start concentrating on how to do the important stuff well, how to get most of life correct. So that's the key to philosophical pragmatism. It's a disaster if you think of it as an endpoint, but there are a lot of people for whom this may be the only starting point that works at all. So, hope that helps. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.